Gotcha. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome all to the American Enterprise Institute's annual dinner and Francis Boyer Lecture. AEI has had a hugely prolific year, and I think a productive one. Being politically nonpartisan and finding ourselves in a season of mellow bipartisanship, we thought it would be fitting to bestow our 1996 Boyer Award on a lifelong Republican who had been instrumental in President Clinton's re-election. Dick Morris had another engagement this evening, but we were fortunate to identify someone else who fits the description even better. Many of those who make the Institute's work possible are here tonight: AEI scholars, fellows and staff, its trustees, and its financial supporters. On behalf of the former, I extend our sincere and heartfelt gratitude to the latter. In particular, I would like to thank Bill Taylor, chairman of the Cigna Corporation and of the AEI Board of Trustees, and Susan Walter of the General Electric Company, George Peoples of the General Motors Corporation, and the 60 men and women on the AEI Dinner Committee for their energetic work in attracting such an impressive congregation here this evening. The Francis Boyer Award was established by SmithKline Beecham in memory of its distinguished former chairman and chief executive to honor individuals whose accomplishments have exemplified AEI's ideals and demonstrated the power of ideas in practical politics. I would like to recognize and thank Henry Wendt, former chairman and CEO of SmithKline, trustee emeritus of AEI, and businessman scholar in the finest Francis Boyer tradition. We should all be especially grateful that Henry's second career as proprietor of the Quivira Vineyards has been as fruitful as his first, and that he brought along two fine vintages for our enjoyment this evening. The Boyer Award for 1996 is being awarded to Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System since 1987. Chairman Greenspan's tenure, which spans the administrations of 3 presidents so far, has been a time of extraordinary price stability and sustained economic performance. His stewardship of U.S. monetary policy and his earlier tours as chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the Ford administration and chairman of the National Commission on Social Security Reform in the first Reagan administration have earned him a richly deserved reputation as one of the most effective men in American public life. To a rare degree, he has combined intellectual, practical, and personal virtues, that is, economic learning, political astuteness, and judgment and principle. Chairman Greenspan's mastery of money and finance is widely admired and has produced a throng of grateful beneficiaries: savers and lenders, investors and consumers, conservative economists at think tanks, and liberal economists about to assume coveted positions in the second Clinton administration. Equally admirable is another quality that is often only joked about: his reticence. For a public official to speak precisely, expecting that his words will actually be listened to and taken seriously, is a reminder that democratic politics is still capable of weight and substance. These qualities and accomplishments prompt me to 2 mildly contrarian observations concerning current political wisdom. First, it is widely held that new technologies, particularly in computers and communications, are changing the world willy-nilly, mostly for the better, and particularly the world of public policy, generating new markets and commercial phenomena that defy political boundaries and regulatory controls and thereby impose healthy discipline on the power of the state. There is great truth in this, but it is only part of the story. All valuable knowledge is not crystallized in tangible technology. Much of it accumulates low-tech, in books and journals, in collective memory, and in custom and practice, including political practice. It is true that the last 20 years' explosive growth in financial markets and techniques has imposed useful new discipline on the conduct of central banking and monetary policy, making it far more risky for any national authority to manipulate currency prices and quantities to accommodate short-term political pressures. But it is also true that during this same period, much has been learned about what constitutes sound and sustainable monetary policy. While important disagreements remain, the professional consensus has widened and deepened from what it was. The conspicuous success of Federal Reserve policy under Alan Greenspan's leadership has not been due simply to market constriction on its powers. It has also been due to the application of new and evidently superior economic understanding. Now, politics is not a cumulative, progressive enterprise like science and technology. The 20th century is proof that politics is capable of spectacular regression even as human knowledge grows mightily. This week's big Washington Post story heralding the arrival of economic nirvana probably means that a serious and inexplicable recession is on its way. But it is essential to recognize that politics and government are institutions in which ideas, including expert and even arcane knowledge, shape the actions of men. Precisely because technological progress will never banish discretion from government, examples of intellectual progress yielding practical political benefits are to be cherished, celebrated, and studied. Alan Greenspan, ever the diligent student, should be looked to as a teacher as well. Second, concerning this new political fashion for bipartisanship. Bipartisan has become the political class's favorite euphemism for telling the governed that their taxes are about to be raised. But this time around, something more is involved. A justified weariness with the transformation of government into permanent electioneering. But if that is the problem, bipartisanship is not the solution. Political partisanship, like competition between business rivals, is often unlovely to behold. But the purpose of competition, whether political or economic, is not to make life pleasant for suppliers, but rather to protect the interests of citizens and consumers. Partisanship ensures that at least two distinct visions of the proper direction of government will be vigorously debated before the public, and it ensures that in unsettled times, politicians will abandon principle in a naked quest for public preferences, as in the past election campaign, which began with President Clinton declaring himself a stalwart foe of big government and ended with the Republicans boasting of all the increased federal spending they had legislated. In economic markets, bipartisanship is called collusion, and its practitioners are sent to jail. Political collusion should be similarly disdained. Worthy bipartisanship is a way of saying that a public consensus has been achieved on an issue, such as opposing communism, wide enough that neither party sees any advantage in departing from it. This is not the case for most important problems of taxing, spending, and regulatory policy today, where substantial differences need to be hashed out. What is really involved in today's bipartisanship boom is not a desire to suspend the two-party system, but a desire that between elections, popular democracy give way to deliberative democracy. Serious deliberation among representatives of different regional and economic factions is what our Constitution was designed for and has sometimes achieved. But Republican deliberation, meaning mutual enlightenment and compromise, is increasingly difficult in the face of instant mass communication, continuous polling, ferociously well-organized interest groups, perverse campaign finance rules, and other developments that conduce towards plebiscitory politics and servile government. Several useful policymaking innovations have been developed in recent years to ameliorate this problem. The Military Base Closing Commission was one. The Commission on Social Security Reform, chaired by Alan Greenspan, was another. Several more recent commissions on entitlement reform are further examples, including the Clinton administration's Social Security Advisory Council, which will report later this month. These institutions are not bipartisan. They are partisan, but much more than that. They are efforts to carve out space for serious political deliberation in an era where the space for direct legislative deliberation has imploded. Call it second derivative democracy. Elected representatives in turn selecting their own representatives to work on specified problems under specialized temporary constitutions. This is real politics, not a sideshow. In modern government, as in modern economics, the second derivative describes the margin where the decisive action takes place. Alan Greenspan is our most proficient practitioner of second derivative politics. His leadership of the Social Security Commission, for which he was roundly criticized by all sides when the deed was done, as any good legislative leader must be, resolved a grave political crisis that had defied solution through normal legislative, executive, political contention. And of course, the Federal Reserve System is the great and longest surviving mother of all institutions of second derivative politics, consciously designed not to suppress partisan or other disagreements, but to channel and shape them and to protect them from transitory political passions on matters of supreme political importance. Those who are looking for new political forms to restore discipline to representative government on issues that are as contentious today as monetary policy once was, could do worse than to study the institutions Alan Greenspan has led and to notice what manner of public man they have nurtured. It is my pleasure to call upon Mr. Greenspan, whose lecture is titled The Challenge of Central Banking in a Democratic Society, and to present him with the Francis Boyer Award. Finding a memento inexpensive enough to be presented ethically to him on this occasion required the expenditure of many thousands of dollars in time and energy, but we finally found one, a small bowl, and it is inscribed to Alan Greenspan, a steady hand on the monetary helm and skilled economic navigator across political seas. Alan Greenspan. It's down below, but it's wrapped up, so I think we'll just leave it there, okay?
Thank you very much, Chris, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm especially pleased to accept AEI's Francis Boyer Award for 1996 and be listed with so many of my friends and former associates. In my lecture this evening, I want to give some personal perspectives on central banking, and consequently, I shall be speaking only for myself. William Jennings Bryan reportedly mesmerized the Democratic Convention of 1896 with his memorable, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." His utterances underscored the profoundly divisive role of money in his time, a divisiveness that remains apparent today. Bryan was arguing for monetizing silver at an above-market price in order to expand the money supply. The presumed consequences would have been an increase in product prices and an accompanying shift in the value of net claims on future wealth from the so-called money interests of the East to the indebted farmers of the West, who would arguably be able to pay off their obligations with cheaper money. The debates before and since over the issue of our money standard have mirrored the deliberations on the manner in which we have chosen to govern ourselves, and perhaps more fundamentally, debates on the basic values that should govern our society. For at root, money, serving as a store of value and medium of exchange, is the lubricant that enables a society to organize itself to achieve economic progress. The ability to store the fruits of one's labor for future consumption is necessary for the accumulation of capital, the spread of technological advance, and as a consequence, rising standards of living. Clearly, in this context, the general price level, that is, the average exchange rate for money against all goods and services, and how it changes over time, plays a profoundly important role in any society because it influences the nature and scope of our economic and social relationships over time. It is thus no wonder that we at the Federal Reserve, the nation's central bank, and ultimate guardian of the purchasing power of our money, are subject to unending scrutiny. Indeed, it would be folly were it otherwise. A central bank in a democratic society is a magnet for many of the tensions that such a society confronts. Any institution that can affect the purchasing power of the currency is perceived as potentially affecting the level and distribution of wealth among the participants of that society. Hardly an inconsequential issue. Not surprisingly, the evolution of central banking in this nation has been driven by such concerns. The experiences with paper money during the Revolutionary War were decidedly inauspicious. Not worth a continental was scarcely the epithet one would wish on a medium of exchange. This moved Alexander Hamilton, with some controversy, to press for legislation that established the soundness of the credit of the United States by assuming and ultimately repaying the war debts not only of the fledgling federal government, but of the states as well. Equally controversial was the chartering of the first Bank of the United States, which, although it had few functions of a modern central bank, was nonetheless believed to be a significant threat to states' rights and the Constitution itself. Although majority controlled by private interests, the bank engaged in actions perceived to shift power to the federal government. Such a shift was thought of by many as a fundamental threat to the new democracy and an essential element of what was feared to be a Hamilton plan to reestablish a powerful aristocracy. The first bank, and especially its successor, Second Bank of the United States, endeavored to restrict state bank credit expansion when it appeared inordinate by gathering banknotes and tendering them for specie. This reduced the reserve base and the ability of the fledgling American banking system to expand credit. The issue of states' rights and concern about the power of the central government reflected the freewheeling individualism of that time. The Second Bank was a major issue of the election of 1832. Earlier in that year, President Andrew Jackson had vetoed the bill to extend its charter, and the election became a referendum on his veto. The outcome was a resounding victory for Jackson and the death knell for the bank. It has not been easy, however, to separate often seemingly conflicting threads in the debate between advocates of state powers over money and those seeking a national role. When Andrew Jackson vetoed the charter renewal of the Second Bank of the United States, for example, he argued for the severing of the grip on the economy of Easterners and especially foreigners who owned a significant stock interest in the bank. Ironically, by helping to create what was perceived to be an unstable currency, he set the stage for the later development of a full-fledged gold standard, the institution that Bryan railed against in 1896 from much the same populist philosophical base as Jackson. After the Civil War, redemption of the paper greenbacks issued during the war brought an era of a gold standard-induced deflation, which, while it may not have thwarted the impressive advance of industrialization, was seen by many as suppressing credit availability for the rural interests of the nation, which were still a majority. The general price level declined for more than 2 decades, which meant borrowers were paying off their loans in more expensive dollars than those they borrowed. Not surprisingly, mounting pressures developed for so-called reform, with Bryan bearing the standard for subsidized silver coinage, that is, so-called free silver. Though Bryan lost to McKinley in 1896 and, of course, again in 1900, the rural-based pressures for a more elastic currency did not diminish and ultimately were reflected in part in the creation of the Federal Reserve. Nonetheless, many of the proponents of banking reform in the 1890s and in the aftermath of the Panic of 1907 were suspicious of creating a central bank. In very large measure, those concerns underlay the various threads of reform that were joined together in the design and creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Its founding followed a prolonged debate on the balance of power between the interests of the New York money center banks and the rest of the nation, then still largely rural. The compromise that resulted from that debate created 12 regional reserve banks with a Washington presence vested with a Federal Reserve Board. Its purpose was to, quote, furnish an elastic currency to establish a more effective supervision of banking in the United States and for other purposes, close quote. Monetary policy as we know it today was not among the so-called other purposes. That evolved largely by accident in the 1920s. Even with the central bank, the gold standard was still the dominant constraint on the issuance of paper currency and the expansion of bank deposits. Accordingly, the Federal Reserve was to play a minor role in affecting the purchasing power of the currency for many years to come. The world changed markedly with the advent of the Great Depression of the 1930s and the evisceration of the gold standard. The upheaval and still festering fear of New York money interests, as they were called, engendered the Banking Acts of 1933 and, more importantly, of 1935, which vested more of the Federal Reserve's authority with the Board of Governors in Washington. During World War II and through 1951, however, monetary policy was effectively subservient to the interests of the Treasury, which sought access to low-cost credit. With the so-called Federal Reserve Treasury Accord of 1951, the Federal Reserve began to develop its current degree of independence. Although in the 1950s and early 1960s, there were short-lived bouts of inflation that caused momentary concern about sustained increases in the price level, these events did little to shake the conviction of most that America's economic and financial structure would indefinitely and effectively contain any inflationary forces. This prescription certainly seems to have been reflected in the low inflation premium that was then embedded in long-term bonds. That this view was profoundly wrong soon became apparent. The 1970s saw inflation and unemployment simultaneously at relatively elevated levels for some time. The notion that this could occur was nowhere to be found in the conventional wisdom of the economic policy philosophy that developed out of the Keynesian revolution of the 1930s and its subsequent empirical applications. Moreover, these models embodied the view that aggregate demand expansion from almost any level would permanently create new jobs. When that expansion carried the economy beyond full employment, there would be a cost in terms of higher inflation, but only a one-time increase in inflation, so that there existed a permanent trade-off between sustainable levels of inflation and employment. The stagflation of the 1970s required a thorough conceptual overhaul of economic thinking and policymaking. Monetarism and new insights into the effects of anticipatory expectations on economic activity and price setting competed strongly against traditional Keynesianism. Gradually, the power of state intervention to achieve particular economic outcomes came to be seen as much more limited. A consensus gradually emerged in the late 1970s that inflation destroyed jobs, or at least could not create them. This view has become particularly evident in the communiques that have emanated from the high-level international gatherings of the past quarter century. That inflation could reduce employment was a highly controversial subject in the mid-1970s when introduced into communique language drafts. At the meetings I attended as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, the notion invariably induced extended debates. Today, in similar communiques, such language is accepted boilerplate and rarely the focus of discussion. This shift in attitudes and understanding provided political support in 1980 and thereafter for the type of monetary policy required to rebalance the economy. Despite waxing and waning over the decades, a deep-seated tension still exists over government's role as an economic policymaker. This tension is evident in congressional debates, campaign rhetoric, and our ubiquitous talk shows. It should not be a surprise that the very same ambiguities and conflicts that characterize the rest of our political life have their reflection in the nation's current view of its central bank, the Federal Reserve. With regard to monetary policy, the view, or at least the suspicion, still persists in some quarters that an activist expansionary policy could yield dividends in terms of permanently higher output and employment. Nonetheless, there is a grudging acceptance of the degree of independence afforded our institution, and an awareness that unless we are free of the appropriations process, that our independence could be compromised. It is generally recognized and appreciated that if the Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions were subject to congressional or presidential override, short-term political forces would soon dominate. The clear political preference for lower interest rates would unleash inflationary forces, inflicting severe damage on our economy. Notwithstanding, the central bank has not been immune from the suspicion and lack of respect that has come to afflict virtually all institutions in our society since the traumas of Vietnam, Watergate, and the destabilizing inflation of the 1970s. The Federal Reserve's most important mission, of course, is monetary policy. I wish I could say that there is a bound volume of immutable instructions on my desk on how effectively to implement policy to achieve our goals of maximum employment, sustainable economic growth, and price stability. Instead, we have to deal with a dynamic, continuously evolving economy whose structure appears to change from business cycle to business cycle, an issue I shall return to shortly. Because monetary policy works with a lag, we need to be forward-looking, taking actions to forestall imbalances that may not be visible for many months. There is no alternative to basing actions on forecasts, at least implicitly. It means that often we need to tighten or ease before the need for action is evident to the public at large, and that policy may have to reverse course from time to time as the underlying forces acting on the economy shift. This process is not easy to get right at all times, and it is often difficult to convey to the American people whose support is essential to our mission. Because the Fed is perceived as being capable of significantly affecting the lives of all Americans, that we should be subject to constant scrutiny should not come as any surprise. Indeed, speaking as a citizen and not Fed chairman, I would be concerned were it otherwise. Our monetary policy independence is conditional on pursuing policies that are broadly acceptable to the American people and their representatives in the Congress. Augmenting concerns about the Federal Reserve is the perception that we are a secretive organization operating behind closed doors, not always in the interests of the nation as a whole. This is regrettable, and we continuously strive to alter this misperception. If we are to maintain the confidence of the American people, it is vitally important that, accepting the certain areas where the premature release of information could frustrate our legislated mission, the Fed must be as transparent as any agency of government. It cannot be acceptable in a democratic society that a group of unelected individuals are vested with important responsibilities without being open to full public scrutiny and accountability. To be sure, if we are to carry out effectively the monetary policy mission that Congress has delegated to us, there are certain Federal Reserve deliberations that have to remain confidential for a period of time. To open up our debates on monetary policy fully to immediate disclosure would unsettle financial markets and constrain our discussions in a manner that would undercut our ability to function. Nonetheless, we continue to look for ways to expand the flow of information to the public without compromising our deliberations and purposes. We have recently commenced to announce all policy actions immediately, federal funds rate changes as well as discount rate changes, and have expanded the minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee. For many years, the Federal Reserve has maintained what we trust is a highly sophisticated, day-by-day, near real-time evaluation of the American economy, and where relevant, of foreign economies as well. We are able, partly through our 12 reserve banks, to monitor continuously developments in the real world. The information supplied about local conditions by the directors of the reserve banks has been frequently useful in identifying emerging national trends and in evaluating their underlying regional implications. The issues with which we are confronted differ in urgency over time. Inflation concerns were not a dominant factor in economic forecasting in the 1950s and early 1960s. Since the late 1970s, however, such concerns have become an important element in policymaking. More recently, inflation has been low, but its future course remains uncertain. The development of comfortable product and tight labor markets has been a crucial factor in short-term economic forecasts of recent months, a phenomenon for which there is scant historic precedent. There is regrettably no simple model of the American economy that can effectively explain the levels of output, employment, and inflation. In principle, there may be some unbelievably complex set of equations that does that, but we have not been able to find them, and we do not believe anyone else has either. Consequently, we are led of necessity to employ ad hoc partial models and intensive informative analysis to aid in evaluating economic developments and implementing policy. There is no alternative to this, though we continuously seek to enhance our knowledge to match the ever-growing complexity of the world economy. At different times in our history, a varying set of simple indicators seemed successfully to summarize the state of monetary policy and its relationship to the economy. Thus, during the decades of the 1970s and 1980s, trends in money supply, first M1 and then M2, were useful guides. We could convey the thrust of our policy with money supply targets, though we felt free to deviate from those targets for good reason. This presumably helped the Congress, after the fact, to monitor our contribution to the performance of the economy. I should add that during this period we maintained a fully detailed analysis of the economy, in part to make sure that money supply was still emitting reliable signals about the state of the economy. Unfortunately, money supply trends veered off path several years ago as a useful summary of the overall economy. Thus, to keep the Congress informed on what we are doing, we have been required to explain the full complexity of the substance of our deliberations and how we see economic relationships and evolving trends. There are some indications that the money-demand relationships to interest rates and income may be coming back on track. It is too soon to tell, and in any event, we cannot in the future expect to rely a great deal on money supply in making monetary policy. Still, if money growth is better behaved, it would be helpful in the context of policy and in our communications with the Congress and the public. In the absence of simple summary indicators, we will continue our detailed evaluation of economic developments. As we seek price stability and maximum sustainable growth, the changing economic structures constantly present more analytic challenges. I doubt the tasks will become any easier for the Federal Reserve as we move into the 21st century. Congress willing, we will remain as the guardian of the purchasing power of the dollar. But one factor that will continue to complicate that task is the increasing difficulty of pinning down the notion of what constitutes a stable general price level. When industrial product was the centerpiece of the economy during the first two-thirds of this century, our overall price indexes served us well. Pricing a pound of electrolytic copper presented few definitional problems. The price of a ton of cold-rolled steel sheet or a linear yard of cotton broad-woven fabrics could be reasonably compared over a period of years. But as the century draws to a close, the simple notion of price has turned decidedly ambiguous. What is the price of a unit of software or of a legal opinion? How does one evaluate the price change of a cataract operation over a 10-year period when the nature of the procedure and its impact on the patient changes so radically? Indeed, how will we measure inflation and the associated financial and real implications in the 21st century when our data, using current techniques, could become increasingly less adequate to trace price trends over time? So long as individuals make contractual arrangements for future payments valued in dollars, there must be a presumption on the part of those involved in the transaction about the future purchasing power of money. No matter how complex individual products become, there will always be some general sense of the purchasing power of money, both across time and across goods and services. Hence, we must assume that embodied in all products is some unit of output and hence of price that is recognizable to producers and consumers and upon which they will base their decisions. Doubtless, we will develop new techniques of price measurement to unearth them as the years go on. It is crucial that we do, for inflation can destabilize an economy even if faulty price indexes fail to reveal it. But where do we draw the line on what prices matter? Certainly prices of goods and services now being produced, our basic measure of inflation, matter. But what about futures prices, or more importantly, prices of claims on future goods and services, like equities, real estate, and other earning assets? Are stability of these prices essential to the stability of the economy? Clearly, sustained low inflation implies less uncertainty about the future, and lower risk premiums imply higher prices of stocks and other earning assets. We can see that in the inverse relationship exhibited by price-earnings ratios and the rate of inflation in the past. But how do we know when irrational exuberance has unduly escalated asset values, which then become subject to unexpected and prolonged contractions, as they have in Japan over the past decade? And how do we factor that assessment into monetary policy? We as central bankers need not be concerned if a collapsing financial asset bubble does not threaten to impair the real economy, its production, jobs, and price stability. Indeed, the sharp stock market break of 1987 had few negative consequences for the economy. But we should not underestimate or become complacent about the complexity of the interactions of asset markets and the economy. Thus, evaluating shifts in balance sheets generally and in asset prices particularly must be an integral part of the development of monetary policy. The public examination of Federal Reserve actions extends well beyond our stewardship of monetary policy. Our overall management of the Federal Reserve System should and does come under considerable scrutiny by the Congress. Since we expend unappropriated taxpayer funds, we have an especial obligation to be prudent and efficient with the use of those funds. I'm not particularly concerned about the 1/3 of our annual $2 billion budget that is expended to provide financial services to the private sector in competition with other providers. Such services, incidentally, include the clearing of checks, the operation of the FedWire system, and the processing of automated clearinghouse payments. We are reimbursed for those services and at competitive prices still make a reasonable profit for the Treasury. If we became inefficient and uncompetitive, we would be priced out of the market and eventually out of that line of business. An additional 1/6 of our expenses are for providing services to the Treasury and other agencies of government for which we are subject to reimbursement with appropriated funds. For the remainder, which covers mainly monetary policy, supervision and regulation of banks, and currency operations, we have to be especially diligent, for there is no external arbiter. The rapidly changing technologies of recent years are pressing us to review thoroughly our structure and operations. We have already engaged in major consolidations of operations when such consolidations have been made cost-effective by the newer technologies. Although in my experience the Federal Reserve System has been responsible, efficient, and has performed well, the rapidly changing external environment frequently requires us to rethink our role and mission. Even where we can be competitive, it is not the role of a government agency, especially one vested with an unsurpassable credit rating, to seek out all available market opportunities. Accordingly, where specific priced services have become effectively and competitively provided by private sector suppliers, the Federal Reserve needs to reassess whether the extent of our participation in those services fulfills a reasonable public purpose. There are, of course, certain services that the Congress has and will in the future deem appropriate for us to subsidize. But these areas presumably will remain circumscribed. As a step in our periodic reassessment, a special committee of Federal Reserve Board governors and Reserve Bank presidents has been set up to review our priced services operations and other system-wide activities. Another step has been to engage outside accounting firms to audit the Federal Reserve Board and the 12 reserve banks. We had been quite satisfied with the board as general auditor of the reserve banks since 1914. But the range of activities and the reach of the Federal Reserve in recent years requires us to address the perception that we are auditing ourselves without the full arm's length relationship deemed appropriate in today's environment. Finally, the substantial changes underway in bank risk management are pressing us to continuously alter our modes of supervision and regulation to keep them as effective and efficient as possible. More importantly, all of our recent initiatives, especially the strengthening of the payment system and supervision, are critical to a central mission of the Federal Reserve to maintain financial stability and reduce and contain systemic risks. This mission is an extension of monetary policy. Our country cannot enjoy the long-run maximum employment and stable prices objectives we have given for monetary policy if the financial system is unstable. In this regard, the successes of most places are not so much the visible problems that we solve, but rather all the potential crises that could have happened but didn't. Doubtless the most important defense against such crises is prevention. Recent mini-crises have identified the rapidly mushrooming payment system as the most vulnerable area of potential danger. We have no tolerance for error in our electronic payment system. Like a breakdown in an electric powered grid, small mishaps create large problems. Consequently, we have endeavored in recent years, as the demands on our system have escalated, we incidentally clear $1.5 trillion a day by required, to build significant safety redundancies. This has been costly in terms of equipment and buildings. Along with our other central bank colleagues, we are always looking for ways to reduce the risks that the failure of a single institution will ricochet around the world, shutting down much of the world's payment system and significantly undermining the world's economies. Accordingly, we are endeavoring to get as close to a real-time transaction, clearing, and settlement system as possible. This would sharply reduce changing circumstances. This would sharply reduce financial float and the risk of breakdown. Meaningful progress has already been made in this direction. This evening I have tried to put current central banking issues in historical context. Monetary arrangements, including central banks, naturally are under constant scrutiny and criticism. This is no less true of the Federal Reserve in 1996 than of the gold standard in 1896. Central banks need to respond patiently and responsibly to the commentary, and we need to adapt to changing circumstances in markets and the economy. A democratic society requires a stable and effectively functioning economy. I trust that we and our successors at the Federal Reserve will be important contributors to that end. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Chairman Greenspan, for that absorbing and illuminating lecture. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us this evening. The dinner program is concluded. I hope that you all have a pleasant evening.
You too.